You're most well known for your Wagnerian singing, but earlier in your career you sang other roles, Italian opera, for example.
Yes, practically everything, not only Italian, but much of the French and Mozart and the entire repertoire. I sang 89 roles, only 9 of which were Wagnerian. So,
I think it's because there are so few people who can sing Wagner that that's what you're most well known for.
well, I remember a story early in my career. I loved to sing the singer in Rosenkavalier. First of all, it's a beautiful role. The aria is marvelous to sing, and it's so short. And just what you say, the director of the opera said, "What? You think I'm going to let you sing that again now that you sing Wagner roles?" You have to have a full evening, not something like that. But it's really true. It's a penalty in a way. When you do start singing Wagner, you have to give an awfully long evening.
Well, there are just so few people who can sing Wagner at all. But tell us a little bit about what were some of your favorite roles in Italian opera?
Well, Italian, of course, I sang 14 Verdi roles, so I loved all of those, most of them at least, you know. And of those, I certainly loved Radames, and I particularly loved Alvaro in Forza. And I did sing Traviata a lot, too. And Maskenball, I was going to say in German, the Un Ballo. Then, of course, I sang the Mozart. I loved Tamino. And the peripheral things, my most sung role for many years was Hoffman in Tales of Hoffman. And then Carmen, of course, and things like Samson and Delilah, things like Eugene Onegin, you know, as we say, right across the board in practically every composer you can think of, and a lot of modern things. The opening of the New Metropolitan, of course, was Samuel Barber opera written especially for the opening. So that was a new work, and I did a lot of new works, and also in Germany. The modern composers like Peter Grimes from Britain, that was a role I especially enjoyed singing.
Would you have been happy continuing singing non-Wagnerian roles, or did you feel yourself ready to sing Wagner?
Well, I must say it's certainly was a drive of mine to sing Wagner. It wasn't only the fact that my teacher was German, had been a director, a conductor, orchestra conductor in Germany, but also the fact that I just felt a kindred spirit with it. Also the fact that the roles are worthy of an in-depth study. You can devote yourself to them. Tristan, you could study all your life and still not get to the bottom of it or the top of it. They were really profound roles worthy of a lot of study, whereas in a lot of the other roles, the text sometimes is so superficial and so funny that it's better not to delve too deeply into it.
We have a recording we're going to listen to now of excerpts from Verdi's La Forza del Destino. Could you tell us a little bit about that recording?
Well, it's one of the first recordings I ever made, and as is often the case sometimes, you walk in with this youthful kind of daring, and sometimes it turns out better than you have intended it to be. And it's still one of my favorite recordings. And this is the aria of Alvaro from Forza, and reminds me of the fact that it was one of my first big successes in Germany. I did this role in television. It was Eurovision all over Europe, and my very first season in Europe. So it made me in one swoop known to a lot of people, and so I'll always be very grateful for this aria.
Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening at this point in the opera?
Well, it's a very complicated story, but at this particular moment, he is a mestize, which is a mixed blood, and he's in love with a noble lady, and he has been found out, as it were, declaring his love for Leonora, and cursing, as it were, his fate, and it's a very passionate aria.
We hear now this excerpt from La Forza del Destino, sung in German by Jess Thomas. We've just been listening to an excerpt from La Forza del Destino by Verdi, sung in German by my guest this evening, tenor Jess Thomas. As we said, you are, of course, most famous for your Wagnerian roles, but you sang many, many other roles, including Carmen. And in a little bit, we're going to play the flower song from Carmen. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think the thing I should tell you about is the fact that my first engagement after going to Germany, I sang one season here by winning the auditions with the San Francisco Opera. I had my first season here and went immediately to Europe. And my first season in Europe was in Karlsruhe, a medium-sized theater in Germany, West Germany. And in my 36 months in Karlsruhe, the 3 years that I was in Karlsruhe, I sang 38 roles. So you can see I was pretty busy. And a wonderful opportunity to learn these roles and go out and sing them, many of which I sang only there and 2 or 3 times. But there was a kernel of my repertoire developing all the time. Things like Carmen and things like Africain, well, I can't even say it in German, of course, L'Africain, and the starting of the German roles. I started singing Rheingold and all of these, but every month a new role, and I got to singing so many roles that at one point I felt like my head was a big piece of a sponge, and it was full, and I couldn't get anything more in it. So, and a variety of styles. One week, for instance, there was a poster that hung in front of the theater in Karlsruhe, and 1 week I saved this particular one because it has I sang every other day, you know, which would actually make 10 days because it was five roles, and I sang 5 different roles, one every other day. And, you know, Traviata, Rheingold, Hoffmann, Boris Godunov, and the last one was Magic Flute. Now, I mean, with what an enormous kind of variety role.
Not only is that a lot of music, it's a lot of very different kind of
Very
music.
different kinds of music and range of tenor to be expected to do Wagner, so to speak, one day and well, you either learn or to save yourself or not.
We're going to hear now the very beautiful flower song from Carmen by Bizet. Would you like to set this up for us, what's happening in the opera at this point?
Don Jose is in prison, has been thrown in prison as it were, and he's met Carmen, and she has thrown him a rose, and he's smelling the rose and thinking on what he thinks is going to be a fantastic romance with this very exciting lady. As we know, it comes out differently.
Once again, sung in German, this is the flower song from Carmen, sung by Jess Thomas. You've just heard sung in German the flower song from Carmen, performed by my guest this evening, Jess Thomas. Now, you're singing at Karlsruhe in Germany, and where do you go from there?
Well, as I mentioned, I stayed there 3 years, but my goodness, practically after the first performance, other theaters started showing an interest. And one very close, the larger theater from Stuttgart, the director became interested in me and started making all sorts of overtures and wanted me to come to Stuttgart. And Wieland Wagner from Bayreuth started writing and wanting to hear me in audition and so forth. And I felt also that my way should really, after Karlsruhe, maybe go directly to Munich. You know, don't stop at go, but go directly to Munich. And all the directors had been so great to me after a stormy beginning. This Dr. Schaefer said, well, I don't think you should spend all your time in Karlsruhe. You can sing with us. So I started singing with them even in my end of my first year in Germany. And that's where we did things like, Lucia and and where I did Hoffmann and a lot of other interesting roles. But I was bound for Munich, and Munich also was very anxious to have me there, and when I did move in '61 to Munich, I did a new Carlos, and I did a lot of Hoffmanns and Tales of Hoffmann. And then they wanted to do L'Africain, and of course in German, Afrikanerin. And this proved to be a fantastic role that I enjoyed so much because it isn't often done, and a lot of people think it's kitsch, as they call it, a little bit not so noble an opera. But I found it really a lot of fun. We had a great old-fashioned production of it, and the marvelous thing is that this fabulous aria, Vasco da Gama has come to India and seen this lovely land and also has fallen in love with a princess and all this and that and everything. But it's so beautiful because every night I sang the aria, the audience would just absolutely tear up the place, and they'd have to stop. They had to repeat the aria every night I ever sang it. And I don't think once there was a performance where I didn't have to da capo. I would give a repeat in the aria. Later, during that time when I was in Munich, it became a very important aria for me because when I came to America for the first time at the Met, the television shows often chose it as one to hear and so on. But it's a lovely, and I have a lot of fond memories of this particular aria.
Besides Wagner, you did sing some other German roles. For example, Weber's Oberon.
That's right, and Fidelio, of course, Beethoven's Fidelio, and just a lot of other German roles. We were talking a little while ago about Stuttgart. It reminded me, I must always repeat the wonderful support I got from these not only directors, the opera directors, but conductors early in my career. And I'm reminded of in Oberon, we did a new production in Stuttgart, and Leitner was the conductor, Ferdinand Leitner. Wonderful guy, and so I was asked to do the role, and I studied it, and I came and had the premiere, and he was very happy with everything, and then he turned around to me after we were walking off the stage together, and he said, he said, there's just one thing, it's kind of strange. He said, I don't know of a tenor ever that has done that in the original key on stage. How come you did it in the original? And I told him because I was too stupid to know that I could sing it any. So they usually transpose the aria half a step down. Because it's a really brutal thing. All those high C's and high B's and so forth. It's not an easy role.
Talking now about your Wagnerian career, Lohengrin was the first role that you sang in Wagner, is that right?
That's correct. I'd studied it before. It was one of the only roles, really, that I'd studied much. And when I arrived in Karlsruhe, I came for my first rehearsals, and a tenor from Australia had been hired to do Lohengrin at Karlsruhe. And they asked me to just study along and, understudy. And it was one of those things that happened in life because they quite frankly said, as a beginner, you'll never have a chance to sing this, but it'll be an opportunity for you to learn it and so forth. And as luck would have it, as time got closer and closer and closer to the premiere, the tenor didn't show. And so I kept pointing out the fact that I did know the role, and if they'd like, I could do some of the rehearsals, And in fact, it got later and later, and I did the first orchestra, what they call a Sitzprobe, where they just have the orchestra, and you sit and sing it with the orchestra. What a thrill this was, my very first time there, and I got to sing through it. And the conductor liked me very much, and then the other tenor did come, and he did sing the premiere, but I sang the second performance. So it was a wonderful, wonderful stroke of luck to be prepared.
Right.
It should be a motto not only of Boy Scouts, but of opera singers.
And this recording that we're going to play now, as conducted by Rudolf Kemp, when was this made?
This was made in 62, yeah, between 62 and 63. And it was the very first stereo recording ever made of Lohengrin. Mm. And it was historically interesting, too, in the fact that we did the recording in Theater an der Wien in Vienna, the theater where Beethoven had conducted and where Fidelio performances had been given, and with so much history. And Kempe was such a fabulous conductor. I enjoyed him so much. And I was under a great deal of pressure because I had to sign a contract that if I didn't finish this within a short time, because I had to go to the Metropolitan, then I would have to give up the contract. I either had to finish it, and I think I had 5 days, or they would not use me. So I started with that sort of pressure. But it was a marvelous thing in the cast, of course, with Fischer Dieskau and Christa Ludwig and Gottlob Fricke, and it was just and the Vienna Philharmonic, of course, and chorus. I was really thrilled, and it came off very well, and it was immediately after the recording, I was on my way to make my debut at the Met in yet another Wagner role.
Well, this is certainly a beautiful recording, and I wish we could play the whole thing. But we're going to play 2 excerpts, and they're both from Act 3. The first is the section of the bridal chamber scene, and we'll follow that with Infernum Land. Would you like to tell us about those?
Well, the bridal chamber is such a beautiful scene anyway, but Höchstes Vertrauen, I had this fortune to work with Wieland Wagner, and he, being the grandson of the composer, did so much introspection, so much really delving into the psychological motivations of each character and working them through, and it was wonderful with him, and he always made a person think what his characterization would be, and he felt in this particular scene that one knew it wasn't going to work out. There was already an aura of she's not going to give up. How stupid he was in the second act to tell Elsa he could tell her everything she wanted to know except his name. Well, tell a woman there's just one thing you can't know. He knew this wasn't going to work. And so it's destined for, he asked too much. It was the thing she could not fulfill. So you already have this feeling, and this then is the last moment of warning, because she's getting closer and closer and closer to coming out and asking that one thing which she dare not ask, because if she asks him, "Where are you from? What's your name?" then he has to go back. He has to tell her and go back to his sainted kingdom. So it's getting close to that, and she's really starting to pinch him, and he stands up at this particular moment before Höchstes Vertrauen. He stands back and says, "You should give me your highest trust." Again, just the way you should talk to. That's not, again, what she wanted to hear. But that, and ending with the fact that, how dare you wonder what I am. I come from, there's nothing wrong with my background. I've come from a land of light and beauty and righteousness and holiness, and shame on you for asking. I mean, terrible, what a nut he was. But that's what it says. Uh-huh. And then the second one, the Infernum Land, she of course is already asking. He does have to go, and now he has to tell him, not only is he going to have to leave, but he has to tell him his name. And so now there's the beginning of, during this, the holy thought of tracing back to Montsalvat, and that is the foreign land, the Infernum Land. That's where I'm from, and there we have a grail, a shrine to the grail, and it's very holy there. And then he, at the end of the aria, says, "And my father was Parsifal, and I am Lohengrin." And so he tells the name, and then he has to leave.
The recording that you made of Parsifal in 1962 at Bayreuth under Hans Knappertsbusch is generally regarded as the definitive recording of the work, particularly for its ethereal quality. Could you talk a little bit about the making of that recording?
was a very exciting time for me. I used to tell Wieland Wagner and Professor Knappertsbusch that it was very unkind of both of them to have had this experience so early in my career, because what would come for high points afterwards? I mean, it truly was an absolute culmination, as it were, right at the beginning of my career. Well, not the beginning, but it's certainly early. First of all, I'd never even seen the opera on stage. Now, obviously, I'd never sung it. And for the first time in my life to be addressing the role in Bayreuth with these two gentlemen, Knappertsbusch and Wagner, was really almost overwhelming, and there in the Wagner Festival. So it was really overwhelming. And Professor Knappertsbusch was ill before the rehearsals began and showed up very late. So I had I had one orchestra rehearsal with him. And it was really a very trying but a very fulfilling, a wonderful time. And again, the working with this gentleman. A lot of people don't know Knappertsbusch in this country, but to me he was, and I can truly say it because any of the other conductors with whom I've worked would understand when I say that for me he was the grand senior of Wagner conductors with whom I had a chance to work. He was really, he gave invitations when he conducted. His instead of giving you a cue to come in, it was an invitation. And was absolutely a fabulous man with whom to work. I get all emotional when I think of this first season in Bayreuth. It was something very, very special.
Would it have surprised you to know that this recording would 30 years later be considered the definitive recording of the work? Did you have that feeling when you were making it?
No, not at all. Of course, I was almost numb. So, and having had I couldn't compare it with other performances I had, was so inexperienced. But it's been a great satisfaction. The Lohengrin is the same way. The Lohengrin recording, although it is a studio recording, is still the best-selling and best critiqued Lohengrin recording, and even almost as 30 years later too. So those I'm very proud of those two records. But the great moment in Bayreuth is something I'll always remember.
It's often said that Wagner himself felt that near the end of his life that so many of the roles that he wrote were just so tremendously difficult to sing that in Parsifal he backed off a little bit, and that Parsifal is not quite as demanding as, well, obviously not as demanding as Siegfried, but of course what is as demanding as Siegfried. Right. But how would you categorize Parsifal in its Wagnerian difficulty?
Well, you're right. First of all, it's basically lower than a lot of the roles, with the exception of Siegmund, tenor roles.
That is to say, the tessitura, the range of the role is slightly lower.
Right. But the dramatic outbreaks are, some of them pretty dangerous, and the orchestra's awfully thick. And insofar as being easier, boy, he didn't take it easy on the Kundry. I had the fortune, incidentally, for this wonderful Parsifal in Bayreuth, my first one, to have our illustrious mezzo sitting down in San Jose, now Irene Dallas. It was such a thrill. She had been at the Met and had done the role, and I was the big diva, and I was just a beginner. And so it was a great thrill, and we became really, really fast friends through this great experience of working together. And she was one of the greatest Kundrys I've ever heard.
She was on the program about 2 months ago, and she had wonderful things to say about you.
Well, she's an exceptional artist, and we always said we'd look forward to the time when we can be retired and out in California. And now that I'm here and a few miles away, I see her less than I did when we were singing.
We're going to hear now two excerpts from this wonderful recording of Parsifal. The first is from Act 2, Am Fortas die Wunde, and then we're going to hear a section from the Good Friday music from Act 3. And could you tell us about those?
Sure. The Am Fortas die Wunde, as we know, Parsifal is the reine Tor. That means the pure idiot. But it doesn't mean an idiot in terms of being stupid. It just means that he is not experienced. And in this particular case, he has just had his first kiss. He has fallen to the he knows the whole story. little by little he's heard the story, but he doesn't know what temptation is. He has never been with a woman, and this kiss is to awaken him to the sensual pleasures and all the temptations that will lead him down the path that Amfortas has been led, and falls prey, and while in the arms of Kundry has received a mortal wound. And that's what he sees now, is he knows this story, and when the kiss, rather than having the erotic, exciting effect on him and drawing him to Kundry, has the opposite effect. It pushes him away from Kundry, and he cries out the wounds of a meaning of Amfortas, and he starts getting an enlightenment of what this giving into the temptation and through the sensual feeling of life would do to his, what he knows now is his mission, and to remain pure, to get back the spear and reunite it with the Grail in the Holy Temple.
This comes at the climax of the love scene.
That's right.
And then the excerpt from Act 3.
In Act 3, having remained staunch, and now Parsifal is going to enter into the temple to purify the temple, to reunite the spear with the Grail, and become the authority, the man who gives the blessing of the Grail to this group of now decadent kind of knights there. And so in order to do that, he has to first be anointed, baptized by Gurnemans, and then he will go into the temple and square things away. But at this particular moment, he is being reunited also with Kundry. Kundry is washing his feet, and he is blessing her and baptizing her, and he points out to her, you see, you, even whatever you've done will be, you'll live again. Look at the meadow. Please look at the meadow. There are new flowers are coming there that have been brought here by the sacrifice and the blood and the tears of others. So that's what we're hearing there.
I'd like to talk with you a little bit about Wagnerian singing in general. It would seem to us mortals that Wagnerian singers have to be supermen or women just to sing the roles, let alone to sing them well. What kind of endurance does it take to sing the roles of Lohengrin or Siegmund or Siegfried?
Well, Siegfried, of course, is the granddaddy of them all, but actually, I've often been asked to define what Heldentenor means. And I said, well, it sounds very close to being like a hell of a tenor. and that's basically what it requires, the endurance, the strength. When I was at Stanford, before I even became a singer, we had a class in work efficiency in a psychology class, where one studied the amount of power and energy utilized per minute by workforce, people loading steel and lifting weights and so forth and so on. And in there was a reference made to the fact that a Helden baritone or Helden tenor during performance time was actually doing the physical work of approximately holding a 100-pound weight above his head.
Is that right?
So I mean, let's start with just the physical, all right? That's somewhere where it is. It's an enormous, to move, to walk, run, and that alone, while singing, it's a lot. But, and one really has to be in good shape. When I was singing, I really felt like I was training for the triathlon or something, you know. I mean, it was really a difficult thing to do.
I was going to ask you if you did anything specifically to prepare for these roles, say calisthenics between acts or oysters and clams for breakfast?
Not quite. I did a lot of, I had, you know, the weather sometime wasn't so that you could get out and run, and I didn't, or the gym was too far away, and so I did have a little regime of yoga. Exercises that I did quite religiously in before performances, and I always tried to keep, walking and just generally in good physical condition and eat well. So those are all important things.
We're going to turn now to one of the roles that is a good deal less strenuous than some of the ones we've been talking about, from Die Meistersinger.
Well, I wouldn't say it was that much less. Oh no, oh no. No, it's, you see, each in its way is difficult. Meistersinger is very long role. And it's the wonderful combination, perhaps one of the best written roles of Wagner, because it's, you know, we have two things. There's the real Heldentenor, which are the Tristan, Siegfried, and then we have the Jugendliche, the young Heldentenor, which is Lohengrin and Meistersinger and so forth. And this one is the most Italian of all. Mm-hmm. It has lots of scope and sweep and phrasing, and it's lovely to sing, but it's very long, so I wouldn't underestimate it's the necessity to. There aren't many good Stolzins. That should point out something to you.
That's true. That's very true. We're going to hear the section from the end of Act 1, and this is where Walter is presenting his song to the Meistersinger Guild.
That's right.
Did you tell us a little about that?
This is his second version already. He's sung a little bit, and they didn't please the Meisters at all with Am stillen Herd, where he was telling him where he was from, and he was being taught by the birds, and they all laugh at that and so forth. And now he's trying a little more earnestly because he really wants to win Ava's hand. And so he's trying to think of all that they have been telling him, and he looking for inspiration, and the marker says, begin, fang it an. And so that gives him his inspiration. He opens then, fang it an. You know, wonderful, kind of brash young genius doing his best. And this, of course, ends up in a big mess, too, because they don't think he's learned a thing. He'll have to go through a lot of study with Sachs and with life before he gets to his winning song, which we heard at the beginning of the program, but only comes in the third act in the opera.
I'd like to talk now a little bit about Tristan and Isolde. You've brought a recording here that is not available commercially, and it's you singing Tristan along with Eileen Farrell singing Isolde, and it's conducted by Leonard Bernstein. This is a private recording from 1969.
That's right. That was for the pension fund concert at the New York Philharmonic in New York. I had ventured off into the heavier things. I was trying to decide whether to go on with these heavier Italian works or to give up and go into the heavier Wagner things. And Wieland Wagner helped me make my decision. And I sang first Tannhäuser in Bayreuth. It was my first foray into the heavy Wagner. And then he immediately was saying, well, we have to do Tristan, we have to do Tristan. And he and I were ready to do Tristan and Isolde together in San Francisco in 1967. And unfortunately, he passed away the year before, and the year that I had done my first Tannhäuser with him. So there sat the contract with Adler in San Francisco, and so I was slated to do it, and I did do my first Tristan in San Francisco Opera, with my dear friend and mentor, Kurt Adler, fulfilling his part, doing everything he could to make it easy for me to do my first Tristan. It's an unbelievable role. But this recording in particular was, I had never sung Wagner with Eileen Farrell, and this came to be a thing that happened quite often. Bernstein and Farrell and Thomas did concerts in New York quite often together then thereafter. And I did them all over America with her, and particularly with this Tristan. And what can you say about Tristan? You know, I always said if I could still sing it at 75, I still wouldn't understand what I was singing. And one knows that at 75 you can't sing Tristan. But it's a Mount Everest among roles, and you know you're never going to get to the top of it, but you try each time to get a little higher. And it was, every performance was so exciting, so wonderful. In fact, I can truthfully say that some evenings of Meistersinger seemed unending. They would seem very long. Parsifal could get very long, and certainly Siegfried could get long. But never once did I ever feel that the evening was long in Tristan.
That's very interesting, because often I've heard people complain, I don't agree with the complaint, but I've heard people complain that the third act of Tristan is nothing happens and it's so tremendously long. But it's interesting to hear you say that.
Of course, I think the music is fantastic. And I think one of my funniest stories is that I sang it often with Professor Carl Böhm. He told the story about the conductor always thought the tenor of the third act was so bad, and when he finally sings his last Isolde, he said, "Endlich ist der Schwein tot." Finally, the pig is dead. So a lot of people in the audience probably feel the same way, but the unbelievable music and the unbelievable sacrifice that it takes to even bring it close to what it's supposed to be.
Perilously difficult with all those time changes in the
yes.
mad scene in Act 3.
Yes, I think he did that on purpose. And Tristan is so tired by that time that if he has to stop and think about the time changes, it perhaps lets him forget that his voice has had it.
Good point. We're going to hear from this private recording the love duet, which to my mind is the most sensuous music ever written by anybody.
Absolutely.
What's it like to sing that?
Orgasmic, it really truly is. It's in order to stage this properly in the meeting of these two at the beginning of the duet in Act 2, you really have to bring the curtain down. I mean, I teach now a lot, and I always tell my students that one forgets that, okay, we sing with a couple of little vocal cords and we have to use our head a lot, and we're taught resonance and good vowels and so forth. But we're not taught often that we neglect to sing with the biggest organ of our body. And the biggest organ of our body is the skin. And if you can't get the sensual, if you can't make the hair rise on your arm or make your goose flesh come, if you can't do that while you're experiencing the singing quality, then don't expect the people out there to get that reaction. In other words, it is a total body involvement. And need I say more then, but with this music, if you can't get a rise out of yourself with this music, then you're dead. This is really the ultimate. Some of the music in Parsifal is also very lush and sensuous. But this meeting of the two lovers at the beginning of the duet in Act 2 is just unbelievable.
No discussion about Wagnerian singing would be complete without some discussion of the Ring. You've sung all of the large tenor roles in the Ring.
That's right. I started with Walküre, actually, while I was still in Karlsruhe. I did the Siegmund the first time. And also, then I did very close, on the heels of that, I did Loge in Rheingold. The only Wagner role, really, tenor role that I did not do was Erik in Hollander. But in the Ring, I've done all the major tenor roles, either Jugendliche or Heldentenor. In fact, one time in Vienna, I think it was 69 or 70, during their festival, they had me sing all of my Wagner roles in the festival. There were, the 9 roles, one after the other, including in a complete ring, all 4 roles. So I had a workout. But anyhow, the two, I loved Walküre. It's just a fantastic role. Siegmund was traveled to Japan with the Bayreuth Festival in that, and I have so many fond memories, and sang it at the Met, and just a wonderful role. And we should save this for the last little bit on our program here, because it turned out to be my farewell performance in San Francisco, but accidentally. It was not planned. I was sitting here in Tiburon one Sunday afternoon, and I had been traveling and singing all over the world, and the phone rang, and it was Kurt Adler, and I was not scheduled to sing at all that season in San Francisco. He said, "Jess, what are you doing today?" And I said, "Well, I'm just cooking a little breakfast for the family, or brunch." And he says, "I need your help." And the tenor for the Walküre had canceled. And I assumed he meant the performance the next day or something. And here it was 10 minutes of 12. And He said, "We need you for the 1:00 performance today."
Not the evening performance, the matinee.
Not the evening, the matinee. Exactly 50 minutes away, or an hour and 10 minutes actually away. So I didn't make a long story short. I did jump in and sang, which then turned out to be my last performance in San Francisco. And it was the only time I ever wound up on the front page in San Francisco. They said, "You see, you don't have to commit some calamity in order to get on the front page." And that was wonderful. The role and it was one of the best, in the fact that you're dead in the second act. It makes it a short Wagnerian role. But the assessing Siegfrieds, the two Siegfrieds, are very difficult. And I was very happy that I was invited to do my first young Siegfried by von Karajan at the Salzburg Festival, the Easter Wagner Festival there. And then the first old Siegfried, as they call him, the more mature Siegfried, I did the following year in Bayreuth for the first time. And it's a role that's, again, you have to think how much there is in the role, and how, to me, it will never quite reach the intensity of feeling that I felt for Tannhäuser and Tristan. But it's a different sort of thing. It's more a sporty. I guess I'm not that sporty a type, or that natural a type. Perhaps the deeper things in my own nature more closely allied with those of Tristan and Tannhäuser than with this young, fearless, sporty, running in the woods type. But I did love to sing it, and it was a great experience. So the recording is made at the Salzburg Wagner Festival with Herbert von Karajan.
We're going to listen to the end of Act 1, where Siegfried is forging the magic sword. Tell us about that.
Oh, there's so many wonderful things about it. The first time I appeared, I don't know why, but this is the first thing I think of. When I appeared for my first rehearsals, ran up on stage, anxious to see that forging scene, the anvil and so forth. We started in, and Karajan was in the pit, started conducting, and we started right with that spot. He wanted to see how it looked and so forth, and it was just with piano, but the first rehearsals. And so he stopped very soon and said, "Thomas," he said, you're leaning way over too far." He said, "Don't lean way over." And so Karajan, was notoriously a short little guy. He was very short. And so I said, "But Maestro," I said, "they've made this anvil for some kind of a midget." Not thinking, and he ran up on the stage and picked up the hammer, and of course it fit him perfectly. And he said, "I see what you mean." So they had the anvil bit.
So you were trying to forge off of Mima the dwarf's anvil.
Yeah, exactly. It was way down there, Anyhow, the things that you have to put up with in Siegfried, the many millions of little details, not only the hammering in exactly to follow the music and throwing Mimi around and so forth, but all of the hand props you have to have, and the movement here and there and so forth. It's so complicated, and takes and then you have to remember that the orchestra is like a wild horse. Once they start that big scene, in the at least half of the whole last half of the first act, once they start, they can't be held back. It's so dangerous to have a long scene where the orchestra keeps playing. It keeps getting louder and louder and louder. You cannot keep them down. So by the end of the first act, you're not only have sung the whole first act and been moving all the time, but you've got an orchestra behind you who's impatient to get to the end of the first act and playing louder and louder and louder. So it's you ask about endurance. That's one that's one of the spots, but that's the Schmiedelied.
I think I heard it said once that just the idea of learning the part of Siegfried, and then on top of that, asking someone to also act it in a sensitive manner, you're liable to get nothing but scorn from a tenor.
Well, it is kind of funny, often in order to test myself to see if I had really memorized a role, I often could sit down and write it like poetry, the text as poetry, and hum them as I wrote it. I would hum the melody, you know, to see it. That was to me the final test to see if I had everything perfect. And it took me, for instance, 3 hours and 45 minutes to write the whole text of Siegfried out. Of course, I was going slow, but you can say, but because I was humming at the same time, and even to speak it, using a 45-minute long speech of some sort, a lot of text.
We're also going to hear the final minutes from the love duet, where Siegfried mounts the magic mountain and rescues Brunhilde from the sleep.
Oh, yes. Birgit Nielsen always used to laugh at me. She would say, you know, just think of it sometimes. She said, while you're out there working during the first 3.5 hours of this opera, I'm going to be in my hotel room eating oranges, you know. And finally, you are served, after working your tail off all evening long, you're served this fresh soprano who comes, and then you have to wake her up, you know. It's very, but what a scene. It's just marvelous. And so I often used to threaten her. I said, Birgit, if you aren't a good girl, I'm not going to wake you up, and you can't even sing then. But it's a marvelous thing to finally wake this goddess up and have this voice come, and then as we hear here the ending, I think some fantastic duet.
Just as a final question, I wonder if you'd tell us about some of your most memorable performances during your career.
Well, we mentioned the one that was so important to me, the Parsifal, my first Parsifal in Bayreuth. And then I think some of the most exciting things that have happened, I had the opportunity, it was for me a great honor, to become known as an opening boy. And it started back in '62 in Stuttgart for the opening of the rebuilt house there. No, I beg your pardon. It was in 1961 for the rebuilt house in Berlin. I opened the house in Berlin, and with Wieland Wagner, and that was a wonderful thing, you know. And so here was a new house being brought to life, as it were, and you couldn't help but feel a little guilty, being an American, to know that the Americans were the ones who'd bombed that theater. But nonetheless, that's was the first one, and then on the heels of that, in Stuttgart, the small house we did with an opening of Ariadne in the original version. And then the following year in '63 was one of the most auspicious performances of my life, and one of the most tragic times of history. The National Theatre in Munich decided to open with a series of 5 new productions. And imagine my feeling of honor that I was invited to do all 5. But time-wise, I simply couldn't. It was not possible. But I did do 3. I did the new production of Frauenauschatten, the new production of Meistersinger, and the new production of Aida. And the date, you will remember very clearly, it was in 1963, November, and the dates were November 21 and 23. So you know what happened right in between. It is, that's correct. It was, Kennedy was assassinated.
November the 22nd, yes.
So we had the opening on the 21st for invited guests of Frauenauschatten, and then on the 23rd with Meistersinger for the public. So that was such a tense moment, and we did not even know. The Frauenauschatten went on without a hitch, but then came the assassination, and we didn't know whether the performance had even. There was such high feeling. The German government was in contact with our State Department to see if it should go and so forth. At least it wasn't Electra, sad opera or something, but still we didn't know until just a few hours before the performance whether it really happened. And then my soprano was another American, a wonderful Claire Watson, who was the Ava. And we came on stage, as always, to greet each other before the performance began. And the intendant of the opera came before the curtain and announced that in honor of President Kennedy, they would stand and sing the Star-Spangled Banner. And that did it, you know. I just dissolved. We just stood holding each other up backstage. So this, and then as if that weren't enough, in the third act, when I came to the prize song, I stood up on my little podium there and getting ready to sing, and there was a big, sharp explosion, and the house was plunged in darkness. The only lights remaining were 5 little 15-watt bulbs, emergency lights, down in the orchestra pit. And the orchestra, having played Meistersinger so often in the Bavarian opera, did manage to go on playing, and the audience didn't get restless, and I went on singing, and for 10 full minutes there was no light in that house. You know, it was dark as pitch. And so that was a memorable moment, to say the least, and it was being broadcast, and people said they didn't even notice it, you know. Siemens, electrical system that had installed the big switchboards and so forth, sent me a marvelous, elaborate gift the next day, a big console with TV and radio and all that sort of thing in it. It's because I saved the day by not stopping or panicking, wasn't it? And then you see another big opening was in 1966. I had the honor of opening the new Metropolitan Opera at Lincoln Center with the great gala performance of Samuel Barber's Anthony and Cleopatra, with Leontine Price and Justino Diaz and so forth, and Tommy Schipper's conducting. And Zeffirelli was the producer. So those are just a few of the highlights, you know. You can imagine, in a career that's taken me everywhere. I've always felt how lucky I was to have come along at a time that, first of all, my career was never interrupted by a war or an illness or anything. I had really the best sorts of people that worked with the greatest conductors that you can imagine and sang with the greatest singers. I feel very grateful. Always can't be grateful enough for the blessings I've had.
We've been talking with the great Heldentenor Jess Thomas. And Mr. Thomas, thank you very much for sharing your memories with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It is a great pleasure.